All right, well, the next 2 weeks, this week and the next, we're going to be looking at the qualifications of a pastor. And I want to take our time through this. This is so important. I want to make sure that we understand what these qualifications are and what they mean practically, and also talk about how we can practically grow in them. There's a lot of misunderstanding with some of these, and I really am convinced that there's a clear understanding of them. I want to shoot towards finding those together and really being able to put our finger on what it is that God calls us to be. Not only, as I prayed, as leaders in the church, but leaders in our homes. Every Christian should seek to embody the principles that we have in these lessons. So as we think about the qualifications of a pastor, I want to start not with qualifications, but with what I've dubbed prerequisites. There's three things that I believe are not necessarily qualifications. We could, banter about semantics here, but I would call them more prerequisites, things that have to be in place before you can even talk about qualifications, okay? And the first one is that if you are desiring to be an elder, you have to be a man. And I want to take a little bit of time and talk about why that is, because there's such pushback against this. I mean, you see what's happening in the SBC if you've been paying attention. They just keep pushing the ball as far down the court as they can get it until they get their way. Of course, Rick Warren pushed really hard just a couple of years ago. And so thankfully there's some faithful men holding the line there, but this is always an issue, and it's more and more becoming one in the day and age in which we live. And we need to be clear about what Scripture says. So you'll notice, first of all, that when you look at the list of qualifications for an elder, which are given to us in 1 Timothy 3, verses 1 to 7, and Titus chapter 1, verses 5 through 9, we're going to be going through those very particularly. But if you just note in the list of those qualifications that the elder is called to be the husband of one wife. And even though we live in a very bizarre day and age, a woman cannot be the husband of one wife. Let's just be clear about that. So it's implied here. Some people say, well, it says he has to be this, he has to be this. Honestly, grammatically, it's hard to make that kind of a case, but it's clear that it's he, because he has to be the husband of one wife. So it's implicit in the list of qualifications. And then as we just look at the role of men in general in Scripture, we find that men are to be leaders in the church in just a general sense. If you look at 1 Timothy chapter 2, just above where we have these qualifications, and you notice verse 8, he says, I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling. And in the context here, he speaks of men. In verse 4, he says, God desires all people to be saved. That's actually a really good translation, because most of the translations say God desires all men to be saved. But that's the general word anthropos, that just means mankind. But here in verse 8, the word for men is andros. So that's specifically talking about the male. And then you'll notice in verse 9, he says, likewise also that the women should adorn themselves. So what does he tell men to do? He says, I desire that in every place the men should pray, lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling. Likewise also the women should adorn themselves in respectful apparel with modesty and self-control and so forth. And then he goes on into the verses we're going to look at in just a moment to speak about her learning quietly, submissively, not teaching. So it's clear in this context that men are to take spiritual leadership in the church. And that's why I'm a strong advocate for the fact that anytime there's something spiritual going on in leadership, it needs to be a man that does it. A lot of churches will let women come up and read scripture and say, well, she's not teaching. Well, I don't like that idea. I would never let that happen if it's up to me. And the reason why is because you send wrong signals when you do those kind of things. And there's just no need for it. Doesn't mean women aren't as good of readers as men. Some are better than men. But Paul is saying here, I want the men to pray. And he's not talking about private prayer. He's talking about corporate prayer. So again, if the corporate assembly has gathered, should a woman lead in prayer? No. The men should lead in prayer. The women should be submissive. They should have an apparel, an attitude, a demeanor of submission. That's just God's way. So that's generally the case in the church. And you see, look down there at that last bullet point in that section, that the roles of men and women in the church mirror the roles of men and women in the home. If you look at 1 Timothy 3, verse 5, he says, if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? So he's making a correspondence here. Verse 4, you're supposed to manage your household, and if you don't know how to do that, how are you going to manage the church? And the connection comes down in verses 14 and 15 of this very chapter. Notice Paul says, I hope to come to you soon, but I'm writing these things to you so that, here's the reason for this whole letter, if I delay, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God. So notice he calls it the household of God. So a man is to manage his own household well so that he can manage the church, because the church is the household of God. It's a family. And so why would God put a female leader in the family of God if men are to be the leaders in their home? And some people will argue with that and say, well, there's mutual submission, which, as I've told you many times before, is a contradiction in terms. You can't have mutual submission. There's just no such thing. Even though John MacArthur actually wrote a little booklet entitled that, he doesn't mean that if you read the booklet. As much as we love John MacArthur, even he makes mistakes sometimes, and that's one of them. Because if you look at Ephesians chapter 5, notice with me in verse 21, he says Christians are to be submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. Okay, so there's that word submitting. But that word is hupotasso, and in the Greek, that's a military term that means to line up under an authority. So it's a one-way street, and I've said this many times. You probably get tired of me hearing it, but I'm going to say it again just to be clear that, if you have a military background, or even if you don't, I don't, but I know enough about the military to know that, if the 5-star general shows up on the base, he doesn't walk up to the private and salute him and ask him for orders, right? You just laugh when you hear something like that. How ridiculous. The private is shaking in his boots, right? Trying to make sure everything's just right. The general's here, right? Of course, that's the way it works. And that's what this word means. It means to line up under a superior, right? That's the idea. So he says, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. And then he goes right into talking about wives and husbands. And they say, see right there, wives and husbands are to submit to one another. But the problem with that kind of exegesis is that it doesn't take into account the context of the passage, because clearly he talks about wives submitting to husbands, and then he goes on to talk about children submitting to their parents. So if we're going to say that husbands are to submit to their wives just like the wives submit to the husbands, then you've got to say that parents are to submit to their children just like the children to the parents. And then it takes another step, because he goes into speaking about slaves, bondservants. That's the word slave, and in that culture that would be a literal slave, obeying or submitting to their master. So if you're the master and you own a slave, I don't think you're going to be submitting to your slave. So it's just clear from the context. It's terrible exegesis to say that there's mutual submission going on. That's why I say if you read John MacArthur's little booklet entitled Mutual Submission, that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about, he's using that terminology in the way that the Bible speaks in Philippians 2 about preferring one another in love. And all Christians are to do that, but that's not submission. That's a different thing. Preferring is not submitting. So I hope that's clear. And in the home, it's very clear that wives are to submit to husbands. Husbands are the leaders. And so when you come to the church, again, I ask, why would God have a different program for the church than he does the home? And it's clear that he does not. And then the final reason why women are not permitted to be elders is because the Bible just says so extremely clearly. If you look at 1 Timothy chapter 2, you find that women are prohibited from teaching men. So in verse 11, let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. There's that word again. He says in verse 12, I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. So there it is. Now, what is the primary function of an elder? As we're going to see in the qualifications, it is to teach. An elder has to be able to teach. And if you look at the qualifications of a deacon that come just after the qualifications of an elder in chapter 3 of 1 Timothy, you see they're pretty much exactly the same, a little more abbreviated form than an elder, except for the fact that a deacon does not have to be able to teach. So the primary function of an elder is to be able to teach, and they teach the corporate assembly primarily. That's the issue. Now, some people will say, well, this is just a cultural thing. Timothy was ministering in Ephesus, and they were mixed up there, and, Paul is just trying to go along with the cultural trends, and the gospel one day is going to set us free and liberate us from all the shackles and chains of society. The problem with that is that in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 13, right after the prohibition is given, he roots the prohibition in the creation order. Notice that, for Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Now, we're not going to take the time to go way into the exegesis there, but just to be clear, he's not saying that women are more gullible than men or something like that, but what he is saying is that God created Adam first. If you go back to the record of Genesis chapter 2, when we zoom in on that first day of creation, God created man in his own image, male and female, he created them. In chapter 2, he zooms in and he says he creates man first, and then he creates the woman out of man, out of his rib. That's a symbolism that he is taking her out of him, that she is the glory of man, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11. The whole imagery and everything that is said there, and what Paul is relaying here, is that the woman was created to be a helper fit for the man. And so Paul is rooting this in creation order, not in culture. And I just want to note here that women are not prohibited from teaching. That's not what Paul means. You could try to read that into verse 12. I do not permit a woman to teach. But notice he says, or to exercise authority over a man. So the issue is authority, teaching and authority over a man. But women are encouraged, even commanded, to teach other women in Titus chapter 2, verses 3 to 5. And to be clear, I don't necessarily think Paul was thinking there of, a theological Bible study or something. He's thinking more of life on life, teaching them, as he says, to love their husbands and their children and so forth. But is it, wrong? Is it prohibited in Scripture for a woman to stand up behind a lectern and teach other women from the Bible? Well, no, I don't think so. I think they can do that. And I think that some women are very good at that. And that's a good thing. And we do that here at our church. And of course, they could teach other children. But they cannot teach or exercise authority over a man, which means a woman should never, ever preach in the corporate assembly where there's men there. And of course, never, ever be an elder. Okay, so I hope that's clear. That's one prerequisite. The second prerequisite is that a man has to have a desire. And I'm not going to take too much time on this because we looked at this in lesson 1. And I just repeated what we looked at there. We talked about the fact that this desire is a longing for the work, not a title or position. It's a longing to serve others sacrificially, to die to yourself, to lay your life down. It's a longing to devote yourself to what the work of a pastor is, primarily to studying the Word and to prayer, to ministering the Word to people. You long to teach the Word and defend sound doctrine. You long to be an example. You're willing to step up and say, follow me as I follow Christ. You're willing to allow others to examine your life and examine your own heart to make sure that you really are qualified and stay qualified and so forth. So that's the kind of desire that Paul's talking about there in 1 Timothy 3. And you just see kind of like a train of thought here. You know, the saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. So, okay, you're a man and you have this desire, and it's a good desire for a good thing. That's great. Well, now, are you qualified? Okay? And really, the overarching issue here, before we get to the qualifications, is spiritual maturity. Because implicit in the title of elder, as we have seen, is that you're an old man. Not necessarily in a physical sense, although that may be the case, but that's not necessarily the case, but you're a spiritually mature man. And we don't need to go back over that because we've already looked at that. Spiritual maturity, which does mean, by the way, that you're not going to be an 18-year-old kid, right? You know, you're going to have some life experience. You're going to have grown. So, you know, there's not an age put on it, but at the same time, it's understood that you're going to have a bit of maturity, and experience takes, maturity takes experience to gain. And notice also in 1 Timothy 3:6 that one of the qualifications that we have here is indeed that he not be a new convert. And why is that? Well, he'll become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. This happens so often where, you know, pastors elevate young men who are green too quickly, and they wind up making a train wreck of their position because they get prideful. And then I would add a point there that spiritual maturity is really required because the pastor is to be the example to the flock, as we've seen. He is teaching not just by what he says, but by what he does. And I would just remind you in that regard of Philippians chapter 3 and actually chapter 4 and verse 9, when Paul says, what you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. And you think of his other statements of imitate me as I imitate Christ. He's not just talking about what he says, he's talking about what he does. And so we have a number of passages that speak of that exemplary aspect of the pastor. And that's what these qualifications are all about. Because as you look at this list of qualifications, both in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1, all of them, except the issue of being able to teach, to know the scriptures, to be able to teach and defend them, have to do with a man's character. That's what God is interested in. Yes, you have to be able to teach, but before we get too carried away with someone's gifting, let's look at their life. And so that's the flow of thought. Again, you desire this. You're a man. You desire this. Well, that's great. That's a noble task. And if you're spiritually mature, then that's going to be seen in your character. So let's look at the qualifications. So we're going to wade into these tonight and then finish them up next week. And so let's look at them. And I've broken them down into just a few categories. And the first one is what I've called exemplary character in general. You should add that to your notes there. Exemplary character in general, because both 1 Timothy 3 verse 2 and Titus chapter 1 and verse 6 use this phrase, above reproach. He must be above reproach. So what does that mean? Well, it's really just a sweeping idea. It's like an umbrella phrase. It's the overarching qualification. And it's going to be unpacked by everything that follows it. So he's just saying in a very general sense, you need to be above reproach, which literally means not able to be called into question in any of the following areas. So I want to be very clear that this does not mean that a man has to be perfect in these areas, because nobody is perfect. But it does mean that there is no glaring issues. There's no pattern in their life that someone could point a finger at and say, this man has a problem in this area. Okay? It's also not to say that the man may not have had a problem with some of these areas in the past. It's looking at where he's at now, and has he been able to show over a period of time consistency in these areas. Okay? Now, that's the overarching characteristic. The second category is that he is to be exemplary in his home. So he's to have exemplary character in the home. And this is twofold. The first area that Paul deals with is marital faithfulness. In both this list and in Titus, he says he must be the husband of one wife, as we've already noted. The phrase in the Greek literally means a one-woman man. Okay? Now, this is one of those designations that is often misunderstood and has, I think, wrongfully restricted some good men from this office. So let's look at what it does not mean. It does not mean that an elder must be married. Okay? It seems like that's what he's saying, but that's clearly not what he's saying, because if you look in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul says that he wishes that all were as he himself. And what's he talking about there? Well, in the context, he's clearly talking about being single. And he speaks of the gift of celibate singleness. He says, I wish that were the case, but, some people will get married. And it's interesting what he says even further on in this chapter. He gives a number of reasons why a man should consider not marrying, and a woman too. And one of them is in verse 32. He says, I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord, but the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. And he says the same thing goes for the woman. In verse 35, he says, I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. So Paul is literally saying here that marriage is wonderful. It's a gift of the Lord too, and it's the norm for most people. But if you're not married, before you go out and get married, consider staying single for the sake of having the freedom to serve God in larger capacities. And when I preached through this, I reminded you that some of the men that we consider heroes of the faith were train wrecks in their family life. They were actually not qualified to be in ministry, which is really sad when you read the biographies. Like John Wesley, his wife left him because he never spent any time with her. A.W. Tozer's wife, when he died, she remarried, and she said, A.W. Tozer loved Jesus, this man loves me. You hear these stories, and it's really sad that we elevate a lot of these men who actually, if people were paying attention, would have never been in ministry in the first place. And that's not to detract from the work they did. God works all things together for good, of course. But it is to say that if you're single, you can do the kind of things that a lot of these men tried to do, and yet really failed in their family life. So you don't have to be married to be an elder. That's not what Paul means. Secondly, he doesn't mean that an elder is not a polygamist. Okay, now we know God's design is one man, one woman for life. The Bible is very clear about that. And if a man has multiple wives, I would not say that he's qualified, okay? But what I am saying is that that's not Paul's intent here. And some people say, see, he's just saying that you can't have multiple wives. That really just can't be the case culturally speaking. Some people say, oh, that's the issue, and it's clearly not. Third, it doesn't mean that an elder must not be a widower who has remarried. That would be very silly to say that you're a man whose wife has died, and now you're barred from this position just because your wife died. Romans 7:23 clearly says that you are no longer bound to that woman. And then probably the most controversial one is that it does not necessarily mean an elder cannot be divorced. Okay? And why do I say that? Well, because there are legitimate reasons for divorce in Scripture. Men try to argue against this, but Jesus clearly says in Matthew chapter 19, he's obviously making the argument for a man to stay married, but he gives an exception that if you are married to someone who is committing adultery, then you have the right to divorce. I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. So he's saying if your spouse is committing adultery, well, you have the right to divorce. And of course, we're not going to take time to go into all the nuances of that, but that is an exception. And then the other exception comes in that same chapter where Paul speaks of singleness in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And that exception is that if you're married to an unbeliever who abandons you, then you are free to go along with the divorce. You're not to be the one to initiate the divorce, but if an unbelieving spouse leaves you, then you are free to go along with the divorce. And sometimes in some really sad cases, I think it's necessary for the Christian to actually initiate the divorce, because sometimes people just leave and they won't legally divorce, and yet they have abandoned the marriage. And so, of course, those are terrible situations, but, you have some good men who maybe that was their lot. Maybe they got married to a woman who cheated on them and ran away. Well, does that mean the man is not qualified? Not necessarily. Maybe he got saved after he married an unbeliever, and his wife never gets saved, and she gets tired of him and leaves him. Does that mean he's disqualified? I don't think so. But I did say not necessarily, because at the same time, there are cases of divorce that I think would disqualify a man. If he's claiming to be a believer and then he, divorced his wife because he ran off with another woman, and, now he's married, and even though he's had a good track record for some years, well, that's a scandalous blemish on his life. But at the end of the day, even in a case like that, you have to think of 2 Corinthians 5:17, right? That if any man's in Christ, he's a new creation. And so we can't hold people's sins from their past life as unbelievers against them. But it calls us to investigate and to look into the situation, each case, and examine it. And I think that there are a lot of cases where it would be, disqualifying for a man who's divorced, and yet there are some where I think he certainly could legitimately be considered for eldership, okay? So, all that said, that's what it doesn't mean. What does it mean? Well, it means to be faithful to your wife. That's simply what it means, to be a one-woman man. To, if you are married, you're faithful to your wife in your heart, in your actions. No one can say that you're a flirtatious kind of man. No one can say that they don't really trust you around other women. And if you're not married, you're a pure man, and you give evidence of that. You're not hooked on pornography, that kind of thing. Okay? So the idea here is simply that an elder is an exemplary husband. He's faithful to his wife, and everybody knows it. They know that he loves his wife, that he cares for her, and that he is devoted to her. All right, so let's think about some personal application here. And the first one there is be devoted to your wife solely. Give yourself to her. And of course, in that sexual area, that she is the one that God has given to you. And the marriage bed is undefiled. And so be devoted to your wife completely in heart and body and mind. And then love your wife sacrificially. That's what Ephesians 5:25 calls us to, right? Love your wife as Christ loved the church. Sacrifice for her. Love her not just with your affections, but love her in your actions. And that comes in all sorts of ways, but it comes in small ways, right? Like, doing the dishes for her when she's had a hard day. Being understanding. Lead your wife spiritually. Also Ephesians 5:26 and 27. Like Tim preached in his sermon, right? We need to lead our wives to Christ and help them to grow in him, be spiritual leaders. And then honor your wife sincerely. 1 Peter 3:7 is a powerful verse. It says that we are to live with our wives in an understanding way. And that means that we understand, we get to know them and we get to understand them as a woman, that they're different than us. They're not one of the guys. And by the way, that's what he means when he says, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel. He doesn't mean that she's, lesser than you in any way. The weaker vessel is the idea of like a fine china in the cabinet, that's beautiful and delicate. She's not one of the boys, so don't treat her like one, This is where chivalry comes from, right? That we open the door for her, that we, don't talk to her in harsh tones, and we don't be crude with her. We treat her like a lady. So, you can take that to an extreme and get weird about it. I've seen men do that, and it's creepy. But at the same time, I've also seen men go the opposite extreme. And that is obviously not what God is speaking of. So be real, but be loving and understanding. Okay, and that's how you can grow in that area. Just take little steps. Just die to yourself. Find ways to serve your wife. Find little ways to love her. Show her affection in public. Not in weird ways, but appropriately. And lead her towards Christ. Make sure that her needs spiritually are being taken care of. Try to free her up so that she has time to be with other women and grow in the Lord if you can. Do a study with her. Read the Bible. Pray with her. Those kinds of things. All right, the other side of this exemplary character in the home is parental faithfulness. Notice there in 1 Timothy 3, he says, He must manage his own household well with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? So it's clear in those verses that managing the household has a lot to do with how you parent. There's more to it than that. Obviously, managing a household is being a good steward in all sorts of ways, but he focuses in on your children, keeping them in submission. And then notice in Titus 1:6, he says his children are believers and not open to the charge of debauchery or insubordination. So let's unpack what he means by that, because he says here that the children are believers. So what does this not mean? Well, it does not mean that your children must be saved. And again, I'm going to part ways with our beloved John MacArthur here, who held to this position, that it means that an elder's children must be saved. I'll tell you why I think that's not the case in just a moment. It also doesn't mean that your children must be perfect. And a lot of men go very astray on this. Men that are already pastors, they wind up disqualifying themselves because they think that their children have to be saved and perfect. And so they drive their children into rebellion. And so it's really sad what people do with these qualifications, like I said. It doesn't mean that they have to be saved, doesn't mean they have to be perfect. What does it mean? It means that they are to be respectful and in submission to their parents, not rebellious. Okay? And you may say, well, the text says they have to believe, right? Well, that's a translation choice, and it's the wrong translation choice. There's no doubt about it that it's the wrong translation. And the word pistos there, it's the adjectival form of the word, and that word typically means faith. It means believing. But it can also mean, and it very often does mean, someone who's trustworthy or faithful or dependable. And you find that option in BDAG, which is, the Bible for Greek scholars in defining words. And there's a wonderful, wonderful article by Matt Waymeyer, who I would commend pretty much anything he writes to you. Just a really good scholar and very clear. He wrote a wonderful article about this, explaining this position. You can find it online there. I would highly encourage you to read it. And so that's what Paul's talking about here. So if you translated this correctly, it would say, if anyone is above reproach, the husband of one wife, and his children are trustworthy, or really what I would like is faithful. They're faithful. And the question is, well, what does that mean? Well, it means they're faithful to their father, to their parents. It's just the idea that they're in submission to their father. Now, why would that be? Why would we understand it that way? Am I just making this up because it's convenient? Well, no, the context tells us how to translate words. And what is the context here? Are we looking for the qualification of the child or of the man? And as good Calvinists, can we save our children? Even an Arminian, if you ask him, can you save your child? Can you make sure your child is saved? Well, no, we can't. We can't ultimately do that. We can lead them to the water. We can't make them drink. Only God can do that. So it's foolish to say that we have to make sure our kids are saved. And I think it's foolish to say, well, if a man's qualified, all his children will be saved. And the question comes, well, how do you know? How do you know for sure? We don't know anyone's heart at any given time, even when they're acting like a Christian. And what if they're little kids? What if they're 2? They're obviously not saved yet. So you get into all kinds of practical problems. But the real issue is, again, who is being examined here, the child or the father? And the issue, if you look at the cross-reference, in 1 Timothy chapter 3, where he doesn't say anything about the children being believing. He simply says that they must be kept by their father in submission. And if you look back at 1 Timothy 6, what qualifies that word pistos there? Well, it is that they are not open to the charge of debauchery or insubordination. Okay, so it simply means that a child's attitude and character are going to reflect the father's ability to lead, because even unbelieving kids can be kept in check. If you're a faithful parent, you can keep your kids in line. You should. So even if you have an unbelieving child, if you're loving them and you're disciplining them, and you're doing that in a consistent pattern, then that child is probably not going to rebel. Now, maybe they will, and if they do, you're not qualified. But typically, they're not going to do that. Typically, they're going to have a loving relationship with their parent, even though they are not necessarily believers, okay? And by the way, this doesn't mean that they never talk back to their parents or never have a bad attitude, but he's talking about kids who are known around town as being those given to debauchery. They're like the town rebel. And if that's the case, then yes, you are not qualified, because it reflects on your ability to lead as a father. And that's what he means in 1 Timothy 3, where he says, if you don't know how to manage your own household, if you can't keep your kids under submission, how are you going to care for God's church? Okay? That makes sense? All right. Now, what's the personal application here? The bottom line is that an elder is an exemplary father. Okay, so how can you grow in that area? Where? Well, be loving and gracious. I love Colossians chapter 3. Look over there. Colossians 3 and verse 21. He says, fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged. So, how can you provoke your children? Well, all sorts of ways, right? Like expecting them to be perfect. That's one way you can provoke a child. You can provoke them by having expectations that are beyond their age. You can provoke them by disciplining them for childish things instead of actual disobedience. You can provoke them by having 500 rules instead of having a few rules that make sense. You can provoke them by being inconsistent. You can provoke them by being a hypocrite. You can provoke them by being a hypocrite and then not asking their forgiveness for being a hypocrite, right? So lots of ways we can provoke our kids. So we need to be loving and gracious and to teach and train them according to God's word. And sometimes that means saying to them, please forgive me, like I have to do to my kids sometimes. Please forgive me. I should not have raised my voice. That was sinful of me. I'm a sinner too. That doesn't mean that I was wrong about what I told you, but it does mean that I sin too, right? And we both need Jesus. That's why we need Jesus. And then you use it as a gospel opportunity, right? And so these are some ways that you can grow in that. Be firm, but be loving, be gracious. Play the long game with your kids. Just love them a ton, and be kind to them. And when you sin against them, own it. And they will respect you for that. Most parents think, well, if I ask my kid to forgive me for sinning against them, then that'll knock the authority out from under me, right? But you'd be surprised. It actually causes you to grow in stature in their eyes, because now they know that you're for real and that you're actually trying to do the same thing you're telling them. Nothing will provoke a kid more than to tell them that old adage, do as I say, not as I do. So be loving and gracious, teach and train them, teach them God's word, Be careful how you do that. I mean, I had a period where I was actually provoking my children because I'd be like, come on, it's Bible time, let's go. Everybody get in here. And I still do that sometimes. Anna's here to call me out on that. But I remember I was getting just really like, we're going to have Bible time. And I was taking too long doing it. And, my wife had to tell me, like, honey, like, this really isn't even fun anymore, And so you can even provoke with that. So, train your children, but do it in a way that makes them love the Lord and love His church and love His word. All right, in the last few minutes we have, let's just step into a couple of the exemplary character list in our personal life. So this is kind of the longest part of this. In our personal life, there's a number of things that we're told we must be if we're to be qualified for the office of pastor, elder, overseer. And the first one in 1 Timothy 3 is to be sober-minded. Sober-minded. What does that mean? It means to have a clear, discerning mind. A clear, discerning mind. So he uses the word sober, but he's not necessarily talking about drunkenness here because he's going to talk about that later on. So by sober mind, he means somebody who has a clear, discerning mind. Someone whose mind is filled with the Word of God, who thinks biblically about things, who has a cool, level head, who's not shaken by things, who's not, spinning off into conspiracy theories and stuff like that. Romans 12:2, says we are to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. And if your mind is being renewed and you are spiritually mature, you're going to have that clear, sharp, discerning mind so that when something happens, your knee-jerk reaction is to think bibline about it. And so an elder is an example of a disciplined mind. How do you grow in this area? Well, you have to discipline yourself to regularly take in the Scriptures, to be in the Word, to be reading the Word, to be memorizing the Word, to be meditating upon the Word, to be regularly in fellowship with God's people, hearing the Word preached and discussing the Word and so forth. That's the positive side. On the put-off side, you avoid ungodly influences. And there are plenty of those influences in our world, right? Unwholesome, videos, music, pictures, websites, things that can fill your mind with not only, sinful images, but sinful thoughts. You can listen to talk radio all day long, and that is not good for you. People who do that don't have a clear, discerning mind because they're so caught up into political things and caught up into what the right-wing guy says that they can't connect the dots biblically. So be careful. Be careful with those things. You grow by disciplining yourself not only in what you're taking in positively, but what you're allowing yourself to take in negatively. Next on the list, and we'll end with this one, is self-controlled. Self-controlled. We see that both in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1. Self-controlled, we're a little more familiar with that idea. It's being characterized by controlling one's appetites in all areas. And we may think of one of these, but I just gave you an example. This is in every area. You control how much food you eat, right? A lot of guys who are pastors are just total gluttons. And that's ungodly. That's not okay. I mean, have a donut, but don't eat the whole box. And I'm being serious about that. You have to have self-discipline. Self-discipline in drink. If you're going to drink alcohol, you better be careful how much alcohol you drink. And I'll even call myself out, maybe I ought to be more careful about how much coffee I drink, something to think about, right? I mean, you can drink so much coffee that it actually affects you physically. And I did that this last week. And I paid for it with the next item, sleep, right? You need to be disciplined in your sleep, self-controlled, getting enough sleep, but also not sleeping too much, being lazy, right? So we can think of all sorts of areas where we have to keep ourselves in check, and we're not going to be perfect in this. You know, how many donuts can you eat? How many cups of coffee is okay? I think 10 is fine. So, what's that?
Donuts or coffee?
Yeah. Well, both and, yeah. But yeah, we need to be careful that we're being self-controlled and realizing that other people are watching us in this, right? And since I, disagreed with my hero, John MacArthur, a couple times, I'll just say one of the wonderful things that I learned from him on just a really practical, basic level was that he would say sometimes he would deny himself something good that he wanted just because, just to show himself that he was in charge. So he had the option of eating some ice cream, and he would say, no, I want it, I could have it, but I'm not going to have it. And that was one way that he kept himself in that battlefield mentality, that I need to always be disciplined. And so I really appreciated that. So it comes down to that very thing, that an elder is an example of a disciplined life. Every area of his life, he is doing his best to discipline himself. And so how can you grow in this? Well, I say watch yourself, right? Watch yourself. Be on guard. I love 1 Timothy 4:16. Keep a close watch on yourself and on your teaching. Persist in this, for by so doing you will save both yourself and your hearers. So guard your heart. Guard your heart and your teaching. And then 1 Corinthians chapter 12, you know that verse, or chapter 10, in verse 12, right before he speaks of God giving us a way out of temptation, he says, therefore let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. And in that context, what Paul is speaking about is being careful that we don't take our Christian liberties too far. He says you can actually go so far as to now damage yourself. We always think of 1 Corinthians 8 through 10 as, being sensitive to the conscience of others. But he turns the corner in chapter 9 in verse 24, and he actually begins to say, watch out that you don't take this so-called idea of liberty to the point to where now you find yourself engaging in idolatry. And so watch yourself. Keep a close watch on your heart. Remember that God has given you liberty so that you could be as far away from sin as possible, not as close to it as you can without sinning. And then be diligent. 1 Timothy 4:7, discipline yourself unto godliness. That's the idea of a Olympic athlete training for the games. As hard as an athlete trains for the competition, you be training yourself for godliness. And then finally, there, cultivate contentment. Because this issue of lacking self-control typically comes from a lack of contentment. We're never satisfied in our flesh. Our flesh will never, ever be satisfied. It always wants another donut, right? We always want to sleep an extra minute if we can, whatever the case. We're just not content with our circumstances, with whatever situation we're in. And so cultivate contentment. Learn to be at peace where God has you, and work on that. I believe the Philippians reference there is chapter 4, and you know that great passage. Paul says, not that I'm speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low. I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I've learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. So whatever situation you're in, learn to be thankful, learn to live within your means, learn to say no to your appetites, even if you could indulge them. 1 Timothy 6:6, godliness with contentment is great gain. And so we're greedy. We're greedy not just for money. We're greedy for all sorts of things. So be content, and you will become a self-controlled person. And this is an ongoing battle. Like I said, as we wrap up here, just a reminder, to be qualified means that you're developing this pattern of life, this kind of character. It's not like you reach the limit, now you're qualified, and then after that you don't have to worry about it. You're someone who's always battling, being an example of that, and knowing that others are watching those kinds of things. Okay? So next time we'll wrap up the rest of the qualifications, and we'll get into talking about qualifications of the ability to teach and so forth, and what that means and what that looks like.